7.
Well, let's return now to our report about a father and son who say the Prime Minister has gone back on her assurances to them that the Catholic Church would be held to account over sexual abuse they suffered while at its schools. The terms of the upcoming Royal Commission on Abuse in State Care excludes institutions such as churches unless children were sent to them by the state. The father says Ms Ardern told him 2 years ago that any inquiry into abuse should not exclude institutions such as churches. And let's talk now to the Prime Minister. Ms Ardern is with us in the Wellington studio. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, in your email of 2013, you say to this family, quote, "I would not like to see our approach excluding institutions or only targeting one."
Yes.
That excludes the Catholic Church. So what has changed?
Yeah, and I can absolutely understand from the perspective of a victim who has not been in state care that yes, they if they've been abused in the church system, yes, this currently as the terms of reference is drafted, they would be excluded.
Okay.
But also I would add that for someone who's been in state care, there's no institution that's excluded. And the reason we've made that difference is acknowledging absolutely that this does mean that, for instance, the person who's written in this case would be technically excluded. But for the reason we've made that distinction is because the state for thousands of children between the period of the 1950s and the late 1990s was essentially a parent to thousands of children, and therefore needs to take responsibility no matter where we sent them. And so that's why we haven't excluded institutions for those children.
But let's just quantify this. Cooper Legal, which is the leading law firm in this particular area, is estimating half the children abused in the church got there via the state.
Yes.
That means 50% didn't get there via the state. So that means they won't be covered.
Yes,
They're going to be excluded.
I haven't seen those numbers, but that does also send the message that the state is often involved. But
just as often as parents essentially were as well, though. So what does that then mean?
That means then that those institutions will be obviously brought into the remit of the inquiry.
Yes, but it means that a lot of survivors will fall outside the remit. Is that acceptable?
But of course, those survivors ultimately often, from the stories they've told me, they want to prevent harm occurring for anyone ever again. So if the aim is to make sure that there is responsibility taken and that there is that institution is being brought into the inquiry, then that will happen via those children who have been sent to those institutions. We've also said, look,
but
it
it does mean that justice is going to be denied to people who appear to have been abused.
Anyone who wants to share their story can. Anyone who also wants to take their case, of course, through the police can.
Some people have gone to the police. It comes down to one person's word against another, as I'm sure you know that's what happened in this particular case. But why would you bother to tell your story if the institution may not be held accountable? Well,
of course, if there are other children who have been placed here by the state, they are covered by this inquiry, and
if there aren't,
will be drawn in.
And if they aren't, then you won't be covered.
Then what we come down to is really individual cases, because there is no doubt that there will be religious institutions who will be brought into the remit of this inquiry by virtue of the fact that children in state care may in some form have been sent there. Now, this inquiry allows us to then look into both what occurred to that child via the state's role in seeking to respond when that abuse was often raised and they didn't always respond to it, but also what actually happened with those institutions too. But I need to come back just a step. We are actually consulting on those terms of reference. There is room for someone to have their say if they feel like that's doing an absolute disservice. But I need to start with why.
But do you think this is doing an absolute disservice? If 50% approximately of the children in this scenario are going to be left out of the terms of reference, surely you, as a government, need to step in and rectify that, don't you?
Well, the reason we started with children in state care was because that was who called for the inquiry. And I have to come back to the original impetus for this and what the Human Rights Commission pushed for, what those victims and survivors pushed for, did come from the place of you are the state and you have to be responsible for us, so please undertake this piece of work. That's where it started. And they were also worried that if we stray too broadly, that their case and their situation would be diluted and the state's responsibility would be diluted. So that was the starting point. And I have to honour that.
For the children involved, though, it makes no difference to them whether they were sent to an institution by the state or by their parents, does it? At the end of the day, if they were abused, if they were raped, while they were at school or while they were at an institution or through the church, isn't that actually what's important? It's about telling the stories and it's about seeking justice.
Yeah, but for the children who came from state care, they were very explicit about the starting point for this inquiry from their perspective. As I say, we are consulting. So
did they want other people excluded?
They wanted us to focus on our responsibility as the state. That was what the basis on which this was called for, the Royal Commission was called for. It's also the basis on which the Human Rights Commission also challenged the government. And because actually it is our responsibility. The one thing I'd also say is the difference, for instance, between what we're doing in Australia. Australia only looked at sexual abuse, but they looked at it across every institution. We're looking at abuse in state care, but emotional, physical, sexual, because I've heard the full ambit of stories. So in some ways, we are looking more broadly.
But equally, you're looking in a more narrow way because you are essentially denying victims here the opportunity to seek redress.
Well, via this particular piece of work, that is the starting point.
But is there going to be any other piece of work?
Well, when you say redress, all I'll acknowledge is that there are, of course, a range of mechanisms that people have. But one of the reasons we wanted to focus so heavily on the state was, of course, because we still have children in our care. We are still responsible, and there are still those who say we haven't fixed anything of the past. So we need to make sure that we are heavily focused on the role we do as the state in the care of children.
Have you come under any pressure from churches to exclude them from this inquiry?
Absolutely not, no.
Well, the Catholic Church told survivors that RNZ spoke to that it sees no downside to being included.
And look, they may well be by virtue of where a child from the state may be placed in their care.
Was it a mistake then to narrow the terms of reference?
As I say, we're consulting on those terms of reference. And when you say narrow, actually, as I say, the Human Rights Commission and those who originally instigated this inquiry always had the state as a starting point.
Would you seek to rectify this, though?
I'll be waiting to hear back from the chair of the Royal Commission, who we've now given the job of consulting on those terms of reference.
Appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming into the studio. That's Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, at 25 minutes to 8.
I haere aki nei tēnei hōtaka. Coming up on the programme, we have the story about employers who exploit foreign students and are getting better at covering their tracks. We look into that.